Hi, Mel.
Hi, Danielle.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Yeah, a quieter week. Tired actually this week, but quieter
Yeah.
week.
Well,
How are
we are
you?
trans. Well, I'm doing well. We are transitioning into these winter months, which
Mm,
is the perfect opportunity to kind of just let us come into what we're talking about, which is mental health and well-being. And as the winter approaches, it's a really good reflection of how we turn in and really
yeah,
start focusing on the things that either we ignore throughout and keep ourselves busy because the months are warmer, or that we are in the holiday season and this tends to be where a lot of our depression comes up and out. You're not getting as much sun time, you're not getting as much light inside of your home. So we're really focusing this new series on mental health and well-being. And so I was wondering, as the guru that you are of the mental health and well-being, if you could tell me and our listeners a little bit about this new series we're doing.
well, it's. I really like the points that you brought up then, actually, because I think you're right. As we approach the darker nights, depending on where you live in the world, and less ability to go out and explore and walk, and like you say, we're not taking in as much vitamin D. Um, the, I thought about this on and off for the last few months, but obviously the timing has really just come to the fore. And I think what you rightly say is we're spending more time indoors and reflecting more, and maybe just cuddling up with our blankets, and experiencing some more relaxing evenings. So what I thought is that we could start exploring, even though we do in some of the other podcasts, the different ideas about what supports us to feel great, and what kind of things can trip us up and get in the way. I wanted to focus specifically on mental health and well-being, because mental health is actually, when you use that word still, it can actually create some fear and ambiguousness in people. And I didn't want to just focus on well-being, because it sort of sits more in positive psychology, and mental health is often more akin to mental illness. And I wanted to sort of really think about how we can understand what mental health and well-being can mean. What is it like for ordinary people, and who's more likely to experience it, but how we all sit on that continuum. And it's really about, like a lot of our podcasts, about helping people understand themselves better and how they manage what at the moment is a chaotic world.
Yeah.
And considering that the statistics show that still 1 in 4 of us will experience a mental health issue each year, and a proportion of those, only a small proportion, will experience anxiety and depression or low mood to the point that it actually interferes in their day-to-day life. And that's what can draw the distinction between something that is a passing experience and something that is actually more clinical and needs to be maybe looked at by another professional. So I wanted to sort of tip over 2 of those spheres. So for those that experience something more serious, we're often thinking about things like psychosis and schizophrenia. Now, I haven't worked in those fields, so I can't possibly really, I've got some understanding of it, but we're looking more at general life experiences.
Yeah,
So,
and when we hit inside of those fields, this is the time that we walk into therapy. This is the time that we reach out and get the help that
yeah,
is available to us, and really start looking down the path of how can I allow somebody to help me. So that would be something that definitely I wouldn't even want to really approach outside of just kind of describing, because neither one of us have those experiences or that depth of knowledge. So that would make sense. So what is your personal work in this field of well-being and mental health?
so I originally trained as a psychotherapist over, about 27 years ago, after the birth of my second son. And since then, I went on to train in other approaches, and it was all about really helping me understand human nature and the kind of things that can make life feel difficult, or different techniques and tools to manage those difficulties and challenges. And after I finished my training, I'd worked with adults, and I then went on to work with children, young people, parents and professionals, often working in schools. So I worked with a lot of teenagers. I tended to work with the over 11s. That was the sort of youngest age group I worked with. And so I worked with lots of young people who were experiencing what you could say were early signs of some mental health difficulties. But for a high proportion of them, it was a passing phase. It was, with some tools and techniques, they could, start to experience school better, improve their friendships, share their worries and concerns, and then move on to the next phase in their life. But what I noticed when working with adults is that a proportion of the adults, and this is what I later found out moving further down my career pathway, had actually started to develop some symptoms of mental health early on. So I was really sort of driven to help young people and parents and professionals alleviate the distress that they felt and find ways that life felt better, more meaningful, and inspire hope. Because if you've been experiencing something for a while, you can sometimes forget where you have had some good times in life, or life's been okay. So that was 27 years ago. And since that first training that I did to qualify me to do that job, I then went on and trained in other things like hypnosis, NLP, EFT, which is the tapping, and a range of other things, really just to help me meet a wide range of people and their needs. Because as we'll talk further, there is actually no real one approach that works for everybody. And as I've found in my work, different techniques, different ways of exploring human nature, whether you look at that philosophically or from a clinical lens. So I'm not clinically minded, but I will be using terminology that does come from the clinical sphere, because people will come into contact with this language as they move through their own lives.
Well, with the gift of technology, we have a lot of information that we can gather. And so the clinical terms are more accessible than finding it the other way. And you're right, being able to define the difference between a season, which you run into a lot with the holiday season, and then a cycle, and differentiating those two patterns and seeing which one is just seasonal and which one's going to come through a pattern of cycle breaking. So thank you so much for what you do in this field of study. This is such it's a life-changing study that you've accomplished, and it's for so many people, including myself. The study of psychology has changed my existence, and having the help of you breaking me through a lot of the arenas that I felt very blocked in has been no less than life transformational. And inside of that, there's this level of respect I have to hand over to somebody that's dedicated their life to the well-being of other humans they come into contact with, be it a friendship or a therapy session. And so for you to take this the next step further and give your information to so many people I'm honored to be a part of this journey with you. And I'm grateful for this. So this leads me to the next question, which is, what motivated you to start this realm of study?
I think initially I didn't really know why I was attracted to doing the work. I think I'd had a different career, and I started after the birth of my second son. I started doing some voluntary work, and I knew there was going to be a career change, but I didn't know what. And I worked for the Samaritans, and the Samaritans is really where you're working with people who are really at the end of their tether, and they're desperate often. And it's a crisis line. It's 24/7, and people can call up at all sorts of times. And I think it was just really, whether that was adult, it was mostly adults. You did sometimes get some teenagers. And the same when I went and worked in the schools, is I come across a lot of people that I just thought, for the first time, they had an opportunity to talk to somebody, and that could relieve them of distress. Sometimes it was something very simple that would make a difference, and sometimes it was a whole range of themes that I'd see emerging through school that I just knew that if we made some changes, we could really make a difference to the kids that were in there. Or I'd work with parents, and parents were trying to do their best, but could be exacerbated by the different demands that are placed on them, whether we're talking about 20, 30 years ago or the modern age.
Right.
And more recently, and this was a theme sort of emerging through around 2015, I started doing a lot of work on programs. So we were working with whole groups of issues. And that was around suicide and self-harm. And, this high proportion of young people that were using self-harm as a way of coping and alleviating some of the distress that they had. And on the end of that spectrum, suicide was, there were adults who were taking their own lives. And it's sad that, somebody gets to that level of mental state, which for many can't wrap their heads around how that can happen. Right. But I was starting to see the numbers come through of what was happening across quite a big patch. And the same with professionals. You can be working, enjoying your job, and then things change or family stresses hit. And it's a really tough journey for people to go on. But I think also what had motivated me more recently were things that I was reading on LinkedIn. There was quite a few people putting posts on there about people who they knew that had taken their own life and the devastation that had caused. Yeah. And I don't believe that people have to just remain distressed for so long without something that can make a difference.
Yeah.
But the thing is lots of people suffer alone because we're still struggling with the idea of what mental health is. Because when we talk about mental health, we're often thinking about mental illness. And so it's a very different conversation for people to have and be comfortable with. And if that's shared amongst friends or families, the way that people manage their difficulties with things that is hard for them to hear is to shut it down and not have any more conversation about it, or be scared that if they do, it's going to get worse.
It's going to get worse, right?
Yeah.
Right. And when you get to that place of suicidal depression, you really are very inward. And I do, just out of experience, because I've walked to that place. And there was not a lot of external things that could help me at that point. And there wasn't going to be the reaching out to people. There wasn't going to be, hey, I need help, because the limited amount of times that I did reach out, I almost felt like nobody cared, because I was in such a dark space. And the other side of it, they don't know how to respond, as you said. They don't know how to make it better, because there's no way of making it better from an external point of view, unless you're somebody that's licensed or knows exactly what they're doing. So, continue. Yeah.
Well, I think sometimes even professionals don't know how to help somebody feel better, so there's often assumption.
When I became suicidal, I was in therapy, and I remember the phone that my husband making the phone call to the therapist, and the way she responded was very, oh my God, do we need to get you into inpatient? I just remember begging, don't put me inpatient, because that will be the death of me, because on my personal level, inpatient was not the route for me to take. So I do recognize that it's hard as a human being to see another human being suffer at that level. You almost freeze. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you've highlighted two really important points. Is there's a lot of information out there, too much information in a way to work through. Yeah. It's quite common for people who experience low mood or depression. And I use the word low mood because lots of people can have low mood, and as you say, can go through seasons and cycles, but it doesn't mean to say that there's anything wrong with you. But when we're using terminology like depression, it normally means something that you've experienced that interferes in your life for longer than sort of 6 months, and it's long-term and enduring. So I tend to use the word low mood because it is synonymous with everyone's experiences.
Yes.
But the other thing you highlight, which is why we don't often talk about, especially anyone, I'd say over 30 really, because I think those of us that were born in the 60s, the 70s, and even the 80s, there was still a lot of stigma around mental health. And somebody knows somebody's grandma that was a bit different, or granddad, who ended up in an asylum and they didn't see them for years. And that fear, it overhangs. And it doesn't and it's a real fear that exists in people. And it was interesting because I used to deliver mental health training with my colleagues in the psychology department going into schools. And one of the first things we asked is, what do you think of when you think of mental health? So even if we are sat now with listeners, we were saying, what do you think of when you think of mental health?
Right.
And we then gather up some of the responses, and the responses were based on sort of somebody who is going, running around a park crazy with a knife in the hand, scaring everybody, but
right.
Almost like the schizophrenic or the psychotic patient.
The extreme of it, yeah.
The extreme of it, which is a very small proportion of society, and there's enough stats out there to show us. And even if somebody does experience something extreme, as you indicated, where you can have days of where you dip to the point that you're seriously wondering whether or not for some it's a switch that's flicked, and I need to dive deeper into the research that really looks at that, because it's very hard to know what it is that's going on for somebody in that point, and it can be they've met a breaking point. For others, it's the swirling of the darkness or the mood that they exist in, that you kind of think, is this the place that I want to reside? And there can be all sorts of things going on for people. And when you don't know what to do that's different, or when you don't realize that actually sometimes a depression is a response to several stressful events where you're tired and your body needs a rest and you need time out. And we're so used to go, and the only way that we can be sick is if we've got an actual illness that looks like a health illness, and we allow ourselves to have rest. So sometimes low mood and depression is a result of just chronic fatigue and stress, and you need to recover. Yeah. And if you don't put things in place at that stage, then the fatigue won't improve itself, or sometimes it's a whole range of other things. So the really important points is that we're often, and that's why I wanted to use the word mental health. I've been part of many focus groups with young people saying, what do we call this service? And they've come up with all sorts of things that is a name instead of mental health or wellness. And language is a powerful thing. And if we're scared of the word, we need to really embrace the word and then have a look at what that means for us. And if it strikes fear in us, have a bit of a deep dive and think, what is it that evokes for us?
Why is this triggering me? And that's something that we do anyways, outside of these just the word mental health. If somebody says something to you and it triggers you, the first suggestion is to go inward and understand why you're being triggered and what it is that you feel inside of that. It being the stigma, the conditioning, enter whatever word you need to enter so that that this is a triggered space, and there's nothing inherently wrong with facing mental health head on and becoming stronger because of it. And I think that actually leads me to the next question is, what types of things are we going to be looking at when we're having this series on well-being and mental health?
So I think there's so many different ways we can look at mental health, and I think I want to try and keep it as simple and as ordinary as possible, which is lots of people are familiar now because we've done so much work in the US, I think, and certainly in the UK,
definitely
around raising awareness, of mental health. It's really the sort of that simple exploration about what it is, what does it mean to us? Or if we're doing fairly okay, one of our friends or family members are experiencing something, how do we sort of avoid the traps in ourselves to help other people whilst not feeling powerless, and actually feeling and realizing what is helpful to other people and some of the simple things that we can do or the things to be aware of. It's also about how kind of where the language comes from, because actually when you study mental health, it's useful, or even if you want to do a training course, it's really useful to have a look at where did all this begin? And what was the process of when we look at psychiatry and psychology, is how mental health, or the language that we use to define the experiences that people go through, aren't always what we've been led to believe they are, because there's an interplay between biology, psychology, philosophy, and how people interpret human distress and difficulties that they have in their lives,
Right.
and also some of the notions and ideas of where that came from. Because when I was teaching mental health in schools, I used to go in with a bit of if you think you're going to understand everything as a result of doing this training, then you're going to be disappointed. Because exactly, because I could go in there and say, okay, this is what depression is, this is what they say it is, and these are the symptoms that if you have them, you're more likely to be experiencing depression. And the same with anxiety or OCD or panic, or some of the other so-called disorders, and that's not language I use.
No.
I think distress or dis-ease, as in we're not at ease, is the simplest way of looking at this. And also how really all of us grow up with some experience of good mental health and well-being, or maybe not. And there's so many factors that influence that, such as parents, family environment, food, the friends that we keep, the job that we do. And as we have been exploring our spiritual natures, what is it that our soul is calling us to do? Because often anxiety can be seen as one thing when actually it means something else. But I think the other thing that was evoked was I have the app Quora, and there's lots of questions and answers on there, and there's a lot around mental health. Yeah. And there's some really awful information on there that people are asking questions of people who have had no experience in the field, don't work as therapists, or haven't done any research. So I think if you're experiencing something around your mental health and well-being issues, it's really, unless you're in crisis, or you need to really seriously seek help now. It's really understanding all the different things that affect your nature and how to make changes on that.
Yeah, it's going to be beautiful, because then, this transfers nicely into the way I entered the space of getting to know myself deeper. And that's through spirituality, the esoteric type things, believe it or not, astrology is quite the psychology of who you are. Same with human design and the gene keys. They're very, very in depth on, and although I don't recommend anybody living their existence based around these are a really good way for you.
They're good frameworks.
To dive in a little deeper and understand the nature of who you are, because maybe you are a little more prone to the darker side of things, because this is how you were made. This is how you came into this world. And embracing that darkness might flip the switch from you having this mundane experience to having an experience that might bring a little more joy into your world, a little more peace to your night, and things like that. And so this whole series is going to be pretty inclusive of all of these different things, the tools that you can use to get to not only know yourself a little bit better, but also to understand how you think and why you think the way you think, the conditionings that have happened to you, the experiences of your life, the root of the issue. We call it a root chakra for a reason, right? The root of the issue. We there's a way that you can pull these things up to the forefront when you're ready, and really have that conversation with yourself or another, and really produce some life-changing moments that can, change the trajectory of your experience.
Yeah, and I think you raise again some interesting facets of this, is that many a creative person goes and delves into the darkest spaces possible and can reside there for a while. And it doesn't mean to say they have anything, or, that it needs to be called anything, but that you can come out of that space and create the most beautiful pieces of art and literature and films. And if you look at some of the films that have been created, I think some of the people that created them had to have gone into some very strange, dark places.
Dark places to produce this magic that, we're born with these two extremes. And, we wave in between them. And, when you hit that lower extreme, I will say, in the depths of my depression, I had the best photography of my life. I was really creating things from this deep place that otherwise I would have never been able to tap into. And I'm not saying depression is something that we should reside in. I'm just saying that baking, affirmation to your point, which is when you get into as a creative being, which we really are all creative beings, we just create in different forms. When you get those low levels, you really are bringing up this creativity that is you, this art that is you. You are a work of art, and how you produce that art is seen through dark lenses and rose-colored lenses.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect of this for me in terms of my personal journey is that when I started studying and I learned about the different theories, because I explored mental health from a philosophical viewpoint as well as, a clinical viewpoint, is that it gave me a language to really, and like you say, those frameworks that you talk about, whether it's human design or the gene keys, it gave me a language to understand some of the experiences I'd had that had influenced me. But I still, even though with all the training I've had, because I had very bad depression after I had my first son, and for a long time, I couldn't really figure out what had activated that. But I kind of know that the environment that I grew up in certainly was an influence. And whether that was to do with, the level of oppression in terms of the capacity to speak out or having your needs met, or spending too much time, by yourself, all of those different sort of themes that can emerge. And I also know that sometimes when we're not aligned, and I think it was a big change in life for me that I wasn't ready for, to become a mother, to give up the career, I just got married, had a baby. And neither do I resonate with some of the ideas that people had saying, no, it was, baby blues. It wasn't. And I know it wasn't. And I think there were a factor of different hormonal chemicals, because my anxiety went through the roof, and I found things difficult. But then I was panicking as a parent. I didn't know how to do it. And I hadn't had a child before, in circumstances very different.
Well, yeah. And I had, when I got the 3 kiddos, my 3 cuties, I experienced, and it was beyond just the grief of losing my mother. It was this whole new life experience now. And you just kind of, regardless if you carry this child to term, you adopt this child, this is a surrogate, this is a life-changing event for you. And it goes beyond hormones. It goes beyond, the easy out of saying you have the baby blues. This is your life has changed forever. And some people experience this in great joy, and some people experience this in, oh my God, was I really ready for this? Was I prepared for this? And both are completely normal and natural. And we don't need to judge one of them, one or the other of them. They just are. And it's okay for you to come and say, I might not have hormonal issues, but right now I am really questioning myself and my choices. Did I make this right choice? And just to normalize that behavior and understand that this is part of the gift that we have as humans, is to question. And to ask yourself why is just to reach in deeper and say, why did I make this choice? Why am I prepared for this choice? How am I prepared for this choice? And allow yourself that freedom and that grace to dive in. And so, I definitely agree with what you're saying with, it goes beyond just the baby blues. It goes beyond just the depression that comes from your hormones going out of whack. As a woman, our hormones are out of whack every 28 to 31 days. So we're used to the ups and downs of that part,
Well, and it's a bit like in the professional field, we talk about ACEs. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so when you have a life event, so we talk about stress, and we talk about the kind of things that increase stress, our life events like birth, death, marriage, change of job, whether they're perceived as good or bad, it's a shift for the personality to go through. But what can happen is if you're not prepared, or you don't quite know what you're expecting, those different life events can pile up on top of each other, and you can feel overwhelmed. And it depends on, and some of the researchers are saying it depends on the level of mental and physical resilience you have in order to respond to those events, will sort of determine to some degree how much they're going to knock you. And now I can look back and say, I was a young mother, and I just got married, and I'd moved into my in-laws, and I'd had a baby, and I hadn't grown up with babies. My baby screamed a lot of the time, and I just panicked, didn't know how to respond. That created a a pretty difficult loop between me and the child,
Yes.
you know, and the whole thing got exacerbated. When you've already got feelings of feeling disempowered or powerlessness, or you've already experienced some mood shifts anyway in your life, they're just exacerbated. So I guess in a way, going back to why I was motivated to do this work, is I know that there probably were some things that could have happened at that time that could have made that journey much easier for me. But because my nature was one, I'm a very private person. So if you're a private person and a bit of an introvert, going out and seeking conversations with people, especially finding ones that are open and receptive,
or even
to where
finding
you're at.
groups, like support
Yes.
groups. This is the opposite of, how I move through this world. Is I'm not
Exactly.
to reach out and find these support groups. It just isn't my style. So what I'm hearing whenever you speak of this is how we're trying to normalize the mental health, and
Yeah.
and we're normalizing this mental health inside of the human experience along what I think you had said, the mental health continuum. And so just a little on that would be nice, how we're doing this, talking about it.
So I think I'd like to share just some of the ways that we can view mental health and well-being in terms of how it can be defined. And it isn't easy to actually come up with one definition of really what mental health is. Like I said, often people are thinking about mental illness, so they're thinking about what it's not. Because we're quite early on in terms of thinking about mental health and well-being. And well-being has sort of taken hold only probably in the last, I'd say 5 years, maybe 10. We had something called the 5 Ways to Wellbeing, which a lot of our local authorities adopted. And it's a bit like coaching. You look at different areas of your life and you see how happy, satisfied, or content you are. But of course, that language comes from positive psychology. So, but mental health generally sits on a continuum. So if you have mental health, you can say at this end of the continuum, I feel okay. And if you have mental illness at that level of an end of the continuum, you don't feel okay. And this is how I used to do it with kids. I used to say, here you're okay, and here you're not okay. And what are the kind of things that are happening in between? Well, the things can be poor sleep, feelings of anxiety, depression. And what happens, what the researchers showed us, that people who ended up in psychiatric units, and we're talking probably more towards say up until the 2000s, that anyone that entered into those spaces had years of accumulating difficulties or experiencing mental health well before they got to that point.
Yeah.
It could be that years of stress. In a lot of cases, there was past abuse. It could be sexual or psychological or physical. And it could be an accumulation of a whole range of experiences that just got to the point where the psyche couldn't cope with it anymore.
Yeah.
So mental health is also a subjective experience. It's very hard to describe to somebody else what you're experiencing when you know that you're not okay. And if you haven't got a language for that, it's also a challenge. It's not only a challenge to communicate that to someone, but also people's ability to understand will largely come from their own experience, which is why I've said this in other podcasts, that I think you can have some great mates out there and you can have some good support groups, but people can get locked into seeing the world from their own perspective. So it's not actually useful to you at times when you're going through some really difficult moments, which is why then go and see a therapist or a coach where you're really getting that space to yourself to be able to express that, because through that expression, it really helps.
It really does.
So we can think about things that move us. If we're feeling okay, or we sit sort of quarter of the way down, stress and fear will move us further up the continuum. But it doesn't mean to say you're going to be that person that ends up with a serious mental health issue, because we know a lot more now about what helps us move back down the continuum. And like you said, with seasons and cycles, we'll move up and down that according to our experiences. We get a new job, we might be really joyous, but we've got bills to pay. So we'll have this fluctuation between stress and happiness and joy, and we can feel all those different things. So if we see it as a continuum rather than I'm mentally healthy and all those people over there have got some mental illness, that can be a really good starting point. It doesn't mean that more awareness means that people understand it better, or that they support people better with their mental health. So like I said about reading Quora, or other platforms where there's lots of solicited advice out there, it's not necessarily going to be beneficial, or reading up a set of symptoms. And because when you're in training and you explore what depression is, you say, oh yeah, I've got all of those, maybe, and then anxiety, same thing. And those, and you go through this phase where you can fit yourself pretty much, and people will experience those symptoms
and that's
generally
what
anyway.
I've talked to you about is, I can take these quizzes and already know I can fit into some of these categories, but I know that I also don't allow myself to go through those extremes, because I've equipped myself with the correct tool belt, and I've really done a lot of discerning when I'm reading. If it shocks you and it doesn't feel right, then it's probably not right. So that's part of trusting your intuition on this. There's a lot of information out there, but that doesn't mean that the information is always correct, especially when it's coming from Q&A answers on places like Quora or these they're trying to be helpful, but the reality is they're only coming from their perspective and not quite through the literature or through the training. And so, discernment is key when you're beginning to research certain things, and TikTok is not the place that's going to teach you that you have autism or ADHD. That's not the place that's going to diagnose you. And I've been noticing a trend of these types of videos coming up saying, do you have this, this, and this? Okay, well, you're autistic. Well, that's just not how that works. I have a lot of the same, I don't know what to say, the same. I could check off the box on a lot of ADHD. I can check off the box on a lot of bipolar. I can check off the box on a lot of depression and a lot of this, but none of these are who I am or what define me. This is just, I have ups, I have downs, I have everything in between. I am a human. I am meant to experience the world at its fullest capacity. And knowing that what I'm going through is a season and not a cycle anymore. And then addressing the cycle came from the first step of being discerning and not taking every bit of information as fact. And then getting the help when I needed it, and asking the questions to myself, and getting myself surrounded by humans that might not have the answers, but hold the space. And so these are all just very important things for us to be aware of whenever we're walking this journey of self-discovery.
I think, though, what you highlight, it's important that it's actually quite tough to be discerning when you're distressed and stressed. So the key element is, are you getting enough sleep, and are you getting rest? Because it's when you have some time out and you can bring your stress levels down, then you're more likely to have access to the part of your brain that helps you sort of reflect on things, and then at the same time tuning your body to do that. But these are practices that need to be hence practice. The other aspect is there are tools out there. So I work, in my day job, we're actually working on a diagnostic pathway for people who think they have autism or ADHD. And there are screening tools that can be used that indicate, and the key word is it could indicate you may have a likelihood to be diagnosed with it. But they have to reach, all assessment tools have to reach a certain threshold before a psychiatrist is more likely to say that it's that. But some mental health illnesses or difficulties can actually be where it's masked, so it can look like it's one thing, but it's actually something else.
Right.
So the tools are helpful. They can give you a better understanding of yourself. But if you're looking to get a diagnosis for something, often it's useful because it can put us out of misery that we've had for years in struggling to be in the world, and that we don't really, or we feel it's difficult to relate to other people or spend time with other people. Then getting some diagnosis sometimes can help people do that. Mm-hmm. But after a diagnosis, you've still got to understand yourself well and learn how to live in the life that you've got.
We call it the bell curve in my house. Yes, this is how you were made, and this is where you're born into, but now you have to understand why, and then be able to figure out how you push forward from this.
Yeah.
The diagnosis is maybe the second or third step. I feel this, now I'm diagnosed, but what am I going to do about this diagnosis? And not that it's like, it's kind of like the way that you were saying this, it reminded me of autoimmune diseases. I have an autoimmune disease, but it shows up as a staph infection, or it shows up as flu-like symptoms, or it shows up as, being lethargic. But at the end of the day, it's this specific autoimmune disease that is showing symptoms in these different ways that are completely separate in every single human you come across. Like, I might share the same autoimmune disease as you do, but your autoimmune disease shows up in different ways than mine.
Manifests in different ways.
Yeah. So that's very important for us to know that, maybe as a society, as a culture, as a whole, we are very similar in our foundation and framework. It's just the details that change, and those details are the way that they expose themselves, the way it manifests itself. And so this is going to be part of the series, how we walk through these things, the things that we how we live a daily experience with a little bit more hope, a little bit more joy, and a little bit more faith and trust in ourselves, and knowing that we can get through everything life has to offer. We are equipped with these things. We just have to find the equipment. And sometimes that's reaching out. Sometimes it's listening to a podcast. Sometimes it's doing your own research. I know people that have gone to school specifically to learn more about themselves in this department. And so there's many ways to do these. And I really am praying and hoping that these, the series that we're doing, or just in general, what you and I are doing together, leads into more of this information and people feeling more in control of what they have and what they can do.
Yeah, definitely. So the key element is having an understanding of, when you hear certain terminology, how do you react to it? Where does that reaction come from? Has this been messages in the family? Have you seen something happen in the family? There's a large proportion of people who've grown up with really difficult childhoods, and of course that's going to affect your mental health and well-being. But everyone's got different levels of resilience, because resilience is an important factor, and there's more research that's come through that. And then the way that you view life, your belief systems, your attitude. And I think the point that you make there, which is what's actually really tricky in mental health, and one of the other things that I would talk to the school teachers about, there is an interplay between biology and psychology, because some of the very early descriptors of mental health and how the classifications came about, years later, some of that was challenged in the mental health field, because some of the people that were experiencing or exhibiting symptoms that looked like, at the time, what they called catatonia or chronic depression, were actually people that had a virus that was killing other people around Europe at the time. So sometimes mental health is challenged because it's a biological experience someone's having. And like what you say, because we've both got those autoimmune diseases, and yours manifests and is experienced in different ways. But I certainly know that if I do too much and I get a lot of fatigue, it's going to affect my mental state, and vice versa. So there's a real interplay.
It really is, because now that I've taken control of my mental health, I've learned along this, because it is a journey. I've learned along this journey what works for me, what doesn't work for me, and the type of rest that I need as my body needs, my mental, my brain clarity needs. And I know now that I was running myself ragged. And so although the changes were gradual, because sometimes when you have children and you have a full-time career and you're married and all of those things, these changes have to be gradual, but the gradual changes do turn into these massive changes in your existence. And one of the things that I will say is that working with your well-being as top priority, because it needs to be top priority above all else, your well-being, because how can you hand out when you're empty? You have nothing to give. And so the more you give to yourself, the more you can give out to other people. And it feels selfish and it feels wrong in the beginnings, but this is the way through, is by taking care of yourself, the way you would take care of your child, and knowing that you are just as important in this world as the people you're raising, as the friends that you surround yourself with the spouse that you have. You cannot give from empty cups. So you have to fill those cups first.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think again that they're fairly new ideas in the last maybe 10 years, that your well-being is paramount and will influence every aspect of your life, and vice versa. If work's
Mhm.
going wrong or your marriage is going wrong, that will affect your mental health and well-being. But I think the key message I really want to give people that may be scared of listening to any podcast around mental health and well-being, and much of them are focused on positive psychology and tips and tricks, but I think sometimes we need to go to those darker spaces, as me and you have sort of alluded to a few times. It's just not to be scared. Fear is one of the most pervasive emotions that disrupt absolutely everything about a person's well-being, and that's been um, activated in such huge amounts over the last 18 months with everything that's happened globally. And,
Right. It's the
people
cycle
have,
of fear that keeps coming, and it just pounds down, and it
yeah,
becomes a small wave that turns into a tsunami. And the more you activate the fear by watching and being involved in the things that are scary, that you can't help, that you can't change, that you can't do anything about,
yeah,
the further away from self you get. And so, I think one of the things is I forgot to wake up in fear, because I got my news from the birds, and I got my news from the sky, so it's like one of those things is where we put our attention to really does make a difference.
yeah. And it'll be all those little things that do make a difference, but certainly the fear has massively ramped up because we're seeing people enter services now that we would never have really seen before.
Right.
So the global pandemic has impacted people in so many different ways. We've seen the social issues, social injustice, the news that evokes fear and panic, isolation, guilt, people feeling worried about what's happening when they go from one family house to the next, the stress on a day-to-day basis, people's jobs are changing. We're going through exponential changes in society, to our family lives, to our friendships. People are falling out over all sorts of things. It is also an opportunity for people to remove themselves from situations that are damaging and disruptive
Right.
anyway. But as you navigate these really chaotic times, is you've got to find, like what you said, initially yourself, discerning the information that's useful to you, listening to things that give you some level of insight about yourself. And like you say, if you're using those tools online, I like those question and answer things. It's often why people go to therapy, because they have an opportunity to really talk about themselves and what they're experiencing, and through that can garner some new information and insight that they didn't
Right.
have, and that's quite fruitful and can sort of elicit some hope and aspirations. And if you've not experienced that it's a really good thing to do.
Yeah.
So it's holding both things at the same time. Neither one is better or worse, but you don't want to live in fear, distress, and isolation, and go into a space mentally where you feel like you're swirling down into a pit of despair.
Right.
And then it's what kind of things can help you if that process is starting to happen. If you're in crises and regularly in crises, then you do really need to talk to somebody. I have a really good friend that can listen. Listening is so underrated, and people really struggle to listen well. But if you've got people who do listen well to you, but again, you don't want to regurgitate the story, because what we've found with depression and what research shows is that by constantly going over the same story of the things that have happened to you, you sort of dig that trench deeper, and what you have
Deeper
to do
and
is build up
deeper.
new
Yeah.
neural pathways. And if those pathways aren't something you've had before, like joy and excitement and happiness, then you can build them in. It just takes a bit more work.
Yeah, that's
So
why it's just as important to have a friend that listens as a friend that can break you through to laugh a little bit,
yeah,
because
yeah,
laughter really is a medicine, and
not
not that
yeah,
it's not a cure, but it's a medicine to help you bring through these. We do talk about neural pathways, and
yeah,
anytime that we can bring laughter into a space of harm, it does trigger a new thought process. It does trigger a new pathway, and it triggers us to seeing things in a different light. And I will never underestimate the power of laughter. for that reason.
Most certainly. Well, my diet of TV is because I tend to never watch the news, but to several people's annoyance at times, because they tell me that I should know everything that's going on in the world.
Well, they can keep up with it and give you the highlights. That's what I tell my husband. You're in charge of the highlights. You're the highlight reel for me. So.
Yeah, share the highlights. But what I'm interested in is, you know, people who are local to me, my friends, professionals I work with, family, community, and the things that are impacting us, because every community is different as well, you know, in terms of how they function and what's going on in that community. But we're all sharing this global experience of massive exponential change. And some people thrive on change and can move forward with that. And other people, you know, are scared and their anxiety levels are going up. And if anyone's listening where they're, and fear, and the tough thing is I always had a soft spot for the teenagers. I mean, young children do get worried. And if you're a parent, you know, even just asking your child how they feel and sitting there, and even if they don't tell you, at one point they will, if you just give them that space, can be a massive step forward for a lot of children.
It really is. I've seen a lot of change in my children, opening up the space for them to just, me not to have an opinion about their feelings. Just to have them, just to have the space as I would a friend, to have the space to display their feelings and me not have an opinion on it, what can I do to set a groundwork for you to be able to express freely? Because sometimes it's as simple as getting it up and out, and it's not within you and it's not eating away at you anymore. It really makes, I am really excited about this series. I think we're going to do a lot of good work, especially, you know, it's funny because I refer to Mel as my guru. There's a whole running joke. I won't even get into it because it's kind of funny and a little,
I'm reluctant to claim the title.
Yeah, there's a reason for that. But I've always told her that I was going to get
to so many of those gurus.
Because we see what happens to gurus. But I'm going to put a poster on the wall of her. And if she makes me mad, I'll throw things at her.
Okay, I'm a bit disturbed now.
We've never questioned the disturbance of Danielle's. We already know it's there. But yeah, so I think what we're about to step into in a lot of different ways, not only facing well-being and mental health, head on, but by also handing over the different series that we're doing that, they all come to this one thing, which is you being able to help yourself, you being able to find yourself, you being able to walk this path and find the things that really bring that spark of life into your life and how you maintain it. And, I think that this series is going to hit home for a lot of people. I know it's going to be moments for us that's very vulnerable because we're going to be expressing some of the deeper, darker things we've experienced in our lives, and allowing this to show that we didn't walk some fairy tale existence to reach the place that we are. We worked really hard to get where we are now, and with the experiences that you and I have held, there is a way out. And I know this fully because I found my way out and you found your way out, and the people that you and I have worked with over the years have found their way out. So there is a way out to anybody that's suffering right now. And don't be ashamed of reaching out for help. Don't be ashamed of reaching in for help. And don't be ashamed of the thoughts that you have, because you're a human being and we all have these experiences. They might not be detail for detail, but we are all here on this.
It's what unites us as humans.
Experiencing the world and its ups and downs, and the way that we view that can really change. The perspective changes everything. And I always tell anybody I work with, perspective will change your life. And so here we are to learn ways to cope and have a new perception or perspective of the way that we live this life. And I'm going to be very excited to hear any feedback throughout, any questions, any advice that, might want to be given from the psychological field all the way to the spiritual field. And because really they're the same. And it's just how you walk your way through this thing we call life in the best way possible, because we deserve the happiness. We really do.
People deserve to feel good more and more of the time, and if not all of the time. And there are many different paths to the same end result. So if there are things that we're talking about that don't resonate, that's fine. There might be other things that do.
Yeah.
Because I found different things work for me at different stages of my journey. And I've tried aromatherapy, I've tried body talk, I've tried psychotherapy, I've done CBT, I've done existential work. I've done shamanic work, spiritual workshops, all sorts of things. And often we try different things because we're seekers on a path to the knowledge and discovery of ourselves and who we are in this world.
The seekers of enlightenment.
And enlightenment is shining a light on and moving further through so that you're in the light more. And and I prefer to reside in this place. There was a time when I didn't think that I'd ever really experience this,
that it would be possible.
That it's possible. So, and I think that's the passion that both of us have, is that all sorts of things are possible, and the possibilities are
endless. There is not one way to reach the goal that you're wanting. Yeah,
exactly.
So I guess, that's about an hour, so we should probably wrap it up. But I'm thankful for you and thankful for your experience and expertise, my guru Mel.
Thanks, Danielle.